Throughout the Vietnam War, U.S. citizens fought to protect their rights and disputed their responsibilities. During this era of social unrest, many Americans questioned the government's decisions and disapproved of the war. One of the main reasons for this conflict was the military draft. Starting at the beginning of the war in 1955, the draft, also known as the Selective Service System, drafted over 2 million men until its end in 1972. What many believed were biased and unfair techniques were used to enforce the draft on ordinary citizens and those who resisted it. This sparked a great deal of controversy and anger in the American public. Ordinary citizens spoke out against the draft and the war in general. The 1960s and 70s were a time of great protest in the U.S., with citizens marching to support the civil rights movement and women's rights. These rallies inspired the youth of America to protest and refuse the draft. The military draft during the Vietnam War was a controversial system that citizens believed was an infringement of their rights because it was unfair, and many believed it was not their responsibility to serve in the war. This widely unpopular system made many Americans lose their patriotic feelings toward military service and their support for military conflict. In the United States, the first war to have a draft was the Civil War, where about 165,000 men were drafted. Over the next 130 years, over 16.3 million men were drafted, with 10.1 million in World War II alone. The people of America, for the most part, cooperated and supported the draft for these conflicts. On July 28, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson approved the Army's request for 125,000 new soldiers and doubled selective military service, starting the Vietnam War draft. A crucial reason that the Vietnam War draft breached the rights of the American citizens was the fact that although many people attempted to apply for conscientious objection, little to no citizens obtained it. Conscientious objection is the exemption from military service due to moral or religious reasons. Citizens claimed that it was not their responsibility to serve in a war that they disagreed with fundamentally and morally. The application rate of conscientious objection during the Vietnam War was 70% higher than it was during World War II. Draft boards were constantly refusing those who applied, and it was nearly impossible to obtain. The Selective Service System attempted to mask the amount of people applying by stating that only 1.7 of every 1,000 registrants were objectors, while in reality the numbers of those who refused to serve were much higher than that. There were more conscientious objectors than actual draftees, and all major cities faced backlogs of induction refusal cases. The Selective Service System allowed for conscientious objection, though it was not easy to obtain, and a system of deferments and exemptions favored the middle and upper socioeconomic classes. Those that refused the draft were in large part men whose religious and moral views contradicted with the war. The lack of acceptance of conscientious objection was a significant part of why conscription was an unfair and unjust method of raising an army during the Vietnam War. During the war, a system of selecting draftees called the draft lottery was put in place. The draft lottery came about in 1969 when President Nixon ordered the Selective Service System to establish a random sequence for induction. 366 dates were placed in a bowl, and those whose dates were picked were inducted. Each lottery consisted of a supposedly random sequence of numbers to all dates of birth to be called for service. If men were born later in the year, they were less likely to be picked, because their lottery numbers were higher. On the other hand, boys with birthdays in the first half of the year lived in fear of being picked for the draft. The introduction of the student draft lottery had an influence on students' political opinions concerning the war. The students were less likely to support the war if their birthday was earlier in the year, and they had a high chance of being drafted. This system was viewed as an unjust and unequal method of picking draftees and caused anger within the youth of America. Many people found themselves in the situation that their only option to avoid the draft was to flee to Canada. Referred to as draft dodgers, those that left believed that it was against their rights to be forced to serve in the war. The estimated number of people who escaped the draft by moving to Canada is between 15,000 and 100,000. When the Americans fled to Canada during the war, immigration regulations did not require them to state whether they were eligible for the draft, and they did not volunteer this information. Mark Frutkin, a draft resistor who moved to Canada during the war, remembers,
"A very high percentage of Canadians disagreed with the Vietnam War. Nobody gave me a hard time about being a draft resistor, ever."
In Canada, resistors of the draft were welcomed and did not face any animosity upon their arrival. The draft during the Vietnam War was also a particularly unfair system because those who were of a higher socioeconomic class had an easier time avoiding the draft. The student deferment program excluded currently enrolled college students from the draft. The wealthy young men of America prolonged their educational careers for years in order to avoid the war. In addition, those who went to college had more knowledge of the best thing to do to avoid the draft. Those of a higher socioeconomic class were also able to obtain conscientious objection easier because there was corruption and bias within the selective service system, especially for the wealthy candidates. This left the responsibility of fighting in the war to the lower class citizens of the United States. Avoiding the draft was a felony, and those who escaped were considered criminals. Refusing to register for the draft was an offense punishable by 5 years imprisonment. When the rate of drafting doubled in 1965, many anti-war and anti-draft protests, hundreds of rallies, and draft card burnings broke out. Thousands were arrested, beaten, or heavily fined for partaking in such actions. In October of 1967, the Students for a Democratic Society, a leftist anti-war protest group, sponsored a national Stop the Draft Week. During this week, thousands targeted induction centers for protests, including sit-ins and police clashes. These riots ended in police beating and arresting many anti-draft supporters. Also arrested were those who burned their draft cards. This was against their rights to freedom of speech and demonstrated police brutality. The best-known anti-war protest during the Vietnam War occurred at Kent State University in Ohio in May of 1970. The protest turned into a riot and quickly escalated out of control. The National Guard was called in, and they fired upon the demonstrators, killing 4 and injuring many others. This breach of First Amendment rights further angered the American public, who called for an end to the draft and the war.
And it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam.
The Vietnam War was widely believed to not be the responsibility of Americans to fight in, because it was an extremely unpopular war.
I did not support the Vietnam War, and many other people in the United States at that time didn't support it at all. It just did not seem like a justified war.
The purpose of the Vietnam War was to eradicate the communism in one small country. United States citizens who were being drafted did not feel the patriotism that they had felt with previous conflicts such as World War II, where they felt like they had a real reason to fight. The unnecessary conflict in Vietnam was not the responsibility of United States citizens to fight in. The military draft during the Vietnam War was a system that many citizens believed should not have been in place. It was widely considered that mandatory military service was not the people's responsibility and was an infringement of their rights. The Vietnam War was against the rights of the people because of their inability to refuse the draft and the harsh punishments they faced if they did. The draft made many Americans question whether serving in a war that they didn't believe in was their responsibility, and most determined that it was not. The American public voiced their opinion that military draft was an unjust and biased method of raising an army. When President Nixon announced the end of the draft in 1972, the United States sighed in relief. To this day, many citizens have strong opinions about the draft. In a Gallup poll taken in 2007, more than 80% of those asked did not support a reintroduction of the draft, and agreed with an all-volunteer army. In addition, in 1977, President Jimmy Carter issued a pardon to any and all draft dodgers and those who fled to Canada. This allowed men who had fled to escape the draft to return to the United States and depicted the government admitting to the faults of the draft. Wars that the United States has been involved in since the Vietnam War, such as the Persian Gulf War, the Iraq War, and the war in Afghanistan, have not used military drafts and have relied on all-volunteer forces. This has greatly reduced the amount of Americans serving in war. The long-term significance of the draft during the Vietnam War is that the draft changed the way that American citizens viewed military conflict. In contrast to previous wars such as World War I and World War II, the people being drafted to the Vietnam War did not believe it was justified or practical, and as a result, the young men of America did not feel the passion and patriotism that they had felt for past conflicts. The draft during the Vietnam War caused citizens of the United States to consider the fact that not all wars should be automatically accepted, and policies against the rights of the people can be changed and challenged through protest.